Welcome everybody to another one of our wonderful North Country Live sessions. We are so excited about tonight's presentation with Tom McGrath as we continue our exploration of the Black history in the Adirondacks. It's been just really an amazing series, and we're so thankful for all of our presenters to bring this information to us. So we're really excited. During tonight's presentation, we're going to keep everybody's microphone muted to make sure that we have really good sound quality. We have a lot of folks joining us tonight, and we want to make sure that you can hear Tom, to the best of our ability. So we're going to keep the mics muted. However, if you have a question, please feel free to type it in the chat. And at the very end of the presentation, Kim will go through and pick out a couple questions for Tom to answer if there's time presenting. So I would like to ask Kim Erlin to say a couple words to introduce our speaker for this evening.
Hello, everyone. I'm co-hosting tonight as North Country Community College's Diversity Officer and as a member of the Adirondack Diversity Initiative core team. Tonight's session is a really fantastic example of partnership and shared vision between not only our college faculty and staff living our values, but the strength of our community collaborations. As I shared last week, the Adirondack Diversity Initiative exists at the intersection of environmental and social equity. And if this is your first time tuning in, you can actually watch recorded content on demand from earlier sessions. This summer, the ADI, as we call it, hosted anti-racism sessions throughout the summer, and those are posted at diversityadk.org. And a copy of tonight's recording will also be posted at both the nccc.edu/live page and the ADI website, as well as both of our YouTube channels, which offers option for closed captioning. We strongly invite you to stay connected with North Country Live. As Selena mentioned, we have more exciting sessions this month, and we're working on a fall series, and I hope to be able to announce more details on the fall later this month. Now I'd like to introduce you to tonight's presenter, Tom McGrath. Tom is originally from Boston and received his bachelor's in history from UMass Amherst and his PhD from the University at Albany. Tom has been teaching at North Country for 18 years and currently serves as an assistant professor and coordinator of our Ticonderoga campus Learning Assistance Center. In 2015, Tom received the Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Adjunct Teaching. He absolutely loves to share his passion for history, and I'm confident that we will experience that passion tonight. So Tom, thank you.
Okay, let's see if I do this right now. That work?
I can see your screen, yeah.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Well, thanks, Kim and Selena, and everyone for tuning in tonight. John Brown. John Brown is one of the most controversial figures in U.S. history. He's had many labels. He's been called a hero. He has been called a martyr, almost a Christ-like figure. He's also been called the first American terrorist. Some people have even questioned his sanity. So tonight we're going to take a brief look at this fascinating and important person in history, sort of an overview of his personal life, and then we'll delve into his thoughts on slavery, which is really what makes him important. But before we do anything, we have to bring John Brown to life. We look at these photographs of these people staring at us from 150 years ago, and oftentimes they look kind of ghostly and sometimes scary. We have to remind ourselves that they were just like us. They walked, talked, breathed, laughed, sang. Actually, John Brown liked to sing, believe it or not. So I'd like to start out with a description from a man named David Reynolds, who wrote a great biography of John Brown. John Brown at 47 seemed taller than his 5 feet 10 inches, wiry and erect. He had not yet developed the stoop that would later lead to the popular image of Old Brown. His dark hair, flecked with gray, stood out in short bristles around his head, giving him a feral look, accented by his prominent ears. His hawk-like nose curved toward his firmly set mouth, which stretched in a grim line across his face. His blue-gray eyes flashed when he was excited or mirthful and settled into a snake-like gaze in calm moments. He dressed in simple, snuff-colored cloth outfits and wore cowskin boots. Often he walked with his hands clasped behind his back and with his eyes fixed on the ground as though he were preoccupied. So hopefully that gets you thinking about what John Brown was like in life. His personality, he could be affable. He could be an excellent conversationalist. He was good at schmoozing, as we call it today. Despite a minimal amount of education, he was highly intelligent, mostly self-taught, read a lot of history. He came from a highly religious Calvinist upbringing. And what that means is there was no gray area between right and wrong, good and evil for Brown. He believed in a wrathful God that would punish sinners. And this really informs everything he did in his life. And that's important to keep in mind as well. He was extremely proud, driven. You could say he had a big ego. What might be considered a character flaw, he had problems being led. He would never consent to being second fiddle. He always wanted to be the captain or the general. And when you collaborated with Brown, it was really Brown's way. He didn't want to take any counsel. So maybe Leos out there know what that's like. People talk about this intensity to Brown when they met him. And this picture that we see right now, I think you can see that coming through, all these years later. He had these piercing eyes. Frederick Douglas said that when he talked to Brown, when Brown got excited, his blue-gray eyes would light up with fire. And so you need to kind of picture that if you were speaking to Brown right now. Brown, throughout his life, was almost always on the move. I just did a quick calculation. He lived in the state of Connecticut twice. He lived in Ohio twice. He lived in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts twice. He lived in Kansas, and of course, North Elba, New York. And he also crisscrossed the region many, many times. I would love to put a GPS on John Brown, the kind that leaves a little line wherever you go. By the end of his life, it would literally look like a road map. He had done so many miles. He spent time in Canada. He traveled across the ocean, and he actually toured Europe by himself in about a month. So it's really a myth that people didn't travel in the 19th century. It really became somewhat common once railroads were established, but Brown's travel is excessive. And, how do we account for that? When I was thinking of a title for this presentation, and I just factored everything in, the name Tortured Life really seemed apt. Brown was always moving out of necessity. He was searching for something. He was moving to get support for his cause. It was just constant motion with him. And for most people of the 19th century, and probably true today, the goal is to buy property, build a home, establish roots in the community, raise a family. Brown never had that. There were moments, but they were fleeting. And we'll see in his life how these changes just kept coming and coming. He was born the first year of the 19th century, 1800, in Connecticut, in this modest home. He would live there till he was 5 when his family moved out to Ohio. And his dad was a tanner. He made leather. So Brown would eventually follow in his footsteps and learn the tanning business and start a tannery of his own. When Brown is 20, he gets married and ultimately moves to Pennsylvania, and he starts a tannery in New Richmond, Pennsylvania. This is looks like a postcard from the turn of the century. That tannery is no longer standing. The foundation is still there, and it is a historic site that you can visit. This tannery did well. Brown had several employees, and things were looking good. But in the 1830s, we see that downturn. And there's that pattern in Brown's life that once things kind of seem settled and established, something happens. In 1832, John Brown's wife dies in childbirth. And very quickly, his business is failing. Debts begin to accumulate, and that's another constant in Brown's life. He was constantly deeper in debt. He will move around a bit and try a number of different businesses to get out of debt. And it's in 1846 that Brown moves to Springfield, Massachusetts. And I love this painting. I'd never seen it before I was putting this together. We see Springfield in the 1840s. And you can see how industrialized it has already become. And of course, we've got meandering through the foreground there, the Connecticut River. So ask my students, what my key to history is. I always tell them, you want to understand history, don't follow the money, follow the water. The water explains so much. So Brown establishes a firm here with a partner named Perkins, and they're wool dealers. They take in wool from growers on consignment, and the idea is they will sell it for a profit. And it seems that this was successful for a bit, but Brown's luck, after about 2 years, we're running into problems again. And Brown and his partner are going into debt, and this time there are several lawsuits against his firm. So, Brown as a businessman, he is a failure. He had been, up to this point, a tanner, a student, a postmaster, a cattle dealer, a wool dealer, a surveyor, a horse breeder, sheep breeder, and a land speculator. Like many others of the time, he borrowed heavily on credit, and that came back to bite him. He also had just some bad luck. Economic, they called them panics back then, but we call them recessions today. And they hit just at the worst time. This is the home that Brown lived in when he was in Springfield. Unfortunately, in 1960, this was torn down for urban renewal. It's a shame because this would have been a great place to commemorate his time there. But along with failed businesses, mounting debts, bankruptcy, and lawsuits, Brown's life was also marked by tragedy. I mentioned a few minutes ago that his first wife died in childbirth when he was 32. In his lifetime, Brown would see the death of 10 children, including 4 in 1 year from dysentery. In 1848, his baby daughter Ellen got sick. Now, Brown was known to stay up night after night with his kids when they got sick, trying to comfort them and nurse them back. And he's doing this on an April evening in 1848. He has Ellen cradled in his arms. He's walking back and forth, and Ellen will die in his arms that night. His wife said that he remained calm, he closed her eyes, and he laid her in the cradle. But when she was buried, Brown, quote, broke down completely and sobbed like a child. So we see this compassionate side to John Brown, which I think is also important to remember. So there's John Brown, the businessman, some of the tragedy that he faced in his personal life. Let's turn to John Brown, the abolitionist, which really makes him important in history. Throughout his whole life, there had been this festering, growing, intense hatred of the institution of slavery. And this started early on. His parents were very much anti-slavery growing up in Ohio. The town they lived in, Hudson, Ohio, was an anti-slavery community. So, Brown soaked all of that in. His dad was active helping fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad. And there's an incident that happens when John Brown is 12 years old that will really traumatize him. His dad sends him on a business trip. Yes, he's 12 years old and he's going on a business trip. He's driving cattle up to Michigan, I believe. And he's staying over in like a boarding house. And the couple had a 12-year-old boy that was a slave staying in the house. And Brown remembers clearly the master becoming enraged, picking up an iron fireplace shovel and just beating this boy senseless over nothing. And he never forgot the treatment of that young boy, and it would haunt him for the rest of his life. You can imagine being that young, seeing someone your age, that could be you, except for the color of his skin. When he's married, he becomes active in the Underground Railroad. That tannery we saw in Pennsylvania, that is located in the northwestern part of the state up by Erie. So it's a great place to funnel fugitive slaves up into Canada. And it's estimated that there were 2,500 fugitive slaves that came through that tannery, which is staggering. In the 1830s, we start to see the slavery debate on a national level really start to escalate. And decade after decade, it gets hotter and hotter. 1837, there's a story that makes the national news. There is a man named Elijah Lovejoy, and he is an abolitionist newspaper editor. One night, he is brutally murdered in his home, and his printing press is dumped into the nearby river. And this event seems to have galvanized Brown's sentiments. There's a memorial service in his hometown, and Brown stands up and in front of everyone declares his commitment to ending slavery. Brown is unique as an abolitionist in a couple ways. First of all, many of the leading abolitionists of the time had different ideas about how to end it. William Lloyd Garrison, probably the most famous abolitionist of the 1830s. He had started a newspaper called The Liberator. And he thought that something called moral suasion would work. So you basically convince Southern slaveholders that slavery is evil and you should stop. And Brown saw way past this. He could see that this was not going to work. The only way you were going to eradicate slavery is through violence. He saw slavery as a war against humanity, and he saw a holy war coming, where he believed that he was an instrument chosen by God. So there's that Calvinist upbringing. So when we look at his actions that he takes in the 1850s, we can't just think that Brown figured his strategy was foolproof. He really believed that God had a hand in helping him. So keep that in mind as well. Here's a quote from John Brown, and this speaks to his belief in violence and ending slavery, and I want you to listen very carefully to what he says. "Nothing but war can get rid of slavery in this guilty nation. It's better that a whole generation of men, women, and children should pass away by a violent death than that slavery should continue to exist." Pretty plain right there. When Brown moves to Springfield to conduct his wool business, here's another case where the place is very important. Springfield at that time is a hub of anti-slavery sentiment. It's an active stop on the Underground Railroad. There are abolitionist speakers coming through. And Brown, again, soaks all of this in. The photograph you're looking at right now was taken by a black photographer named Augustus Washington, who was very successful in his time. It's here that he meets Frederick Douglass. A great picture of Frederick Douglass. And these two men hit it off. They don't always agree. They don't see eye to eye, but they're both have a respect for one another. This is what Douglass said of Brown, and this is really a telling statement. "Brown, although a white gentleman, is in sympathy a black man, and as deeply interested in our cause as though his own soul had been pierced with the iron of slavery." And that brings up another point about Brown's views on abolition and what makes him unique. Brown had zero prejudice. Many of the abolitionists of the day, if you read their writings, they believed that abolition was morally wrong, that slavery was morally wrong, it was evil, but they didn't necessarily believe in racial equality. They were, in their private writings, that they didn't believe blacks had the capability that whites did, that they were mentally inferior. Brown had none of that. In fact, there was a free black community in Springfield of nearing 300 people. And Brown intermingled with them. He went to their churches, he went to their homes. And he really did have this deep respect and admiration for Black culture, which, again, is way ahead of his time. So Brown is very unique in so many different ways. It's in 1848 that Brown, with his businesses failing in Massachusetts, hears of the experimental community of Timbuktu, which Pete Nelson talked about last week. Essentially, a wealthy philanthropist, Garrett Smith, was giving away free parcels of land to free Blacks. And John Brown, this appealed to him for a couple of reasons. First of all, it'd be a chance for him to get back to his roots. He grew up on the frontier, and he was well suited for this. He also thought he could be a father figure. And if he went up, he could help free Blacks if they needed. He could keep them from being exploited. So in 1849, he will move up with his family to North Elba. And I love this photograph here. Here we see Brown's wife and two daughters. And the girl on the left definitely is not happy right here. I believe that's Annie. And if you ever had try to have kids sit for a picture, in this day, photography, you had to have an exposure time of about 10 seconds. So you had to sit perfectly still. Great picture, though. Mary in the center is really an important part of Brown's life. She puts up with his long absences from home. She really is a confidant. There's letters between them, and you can see the respect that Brown has for her. She also has a local connection. She was from Granville, New York, which is about 40 miles south of Ticonderoga. And we actually have some students from Granville at the Thai campus. So they will move up. And by the early 1850s, Brown has some land cleared, and this is what his farm looked like. This is actually a post-war photograph. I didn't have that wraparound porch on it. But it seems like Brown has sort of found his place. He has a farm. He's helping free Blacks. But we know John Brown's luck, and this is not going to last once again. Sure enough, here come the 1850s. Now, I know everyone thinks that the political climate of right now is insane, but it has nothing on the 1850s, trust me. The 1850s is the most volatile decade in American political history. This is when the pressure cooker of the debate over slavery really starts to come to a boil. And it's one thing after another. And we see this escalation. And this decade and what's happening nationally to the country over slavery will influence Brown and ultimately lead him to take action. And that's what we're going to see next. First of all, 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law. This essentially justified and gave more authority to slave catchers who would chase runaway slaves into the North, which they had done before. But what made this different is that if a slave catcher came to your town and asked you for help, you were federally mandated to help that slave catcher. It was law. So this is what rubbed people the wrong way, this intrusion. You have to keep in mind that if you lived in the North, and especially in a rural area, slavery was not on your mind. You could go day to day without even thinking about it. You may not even see a Black person for maybe your whole life. This is what starts to bring the issue of slavery into people's homes in the North. Right on top of that is Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which becomes a bestseller. And this novel exposes the evils of the institution of slavery and really wake up people in the North as to what's going on south of the Mason-Dixon line. Brown would take action, and we see this photograph. He would form a militant branch of the Underground Railroad called the League of Gileadites, and his strategy was known as the Subterranean Passway. And what he does is he tries to organize free Blacks into resistance. In other words, if a slave catcher comes into your community, you sort of come together and resist, fight off that slave catcher. So, and standing here is the flag of the subterranean passway. So once again, Brown is brought into the slavery debate. 1854, Kansas-Nebraska Act. So what I'd like you to do now is look closely at this map. You see on the right well-defined states, but then the entire West, we have mostly territories. We know that there's states going to fill up those territories, but this is what it looked like in 1854. Now, the debate over slavery and even the Civil War itself is not fought between North and South. It is fought over the future of the West because hypothetically, if you have 3 new states that are admitted to the Union and they're all free states, well, that gives you 2 senators from each state, representatives from each state. Eventually, the anti-slavery will outnumber the pro-slavery folks in Congress, and they could essentially vote to abolish slavery altogether. So that's what makes the fate of these territories so important. So will Kansas be a free state or a slave state? Well, the geniuses in Congress come up with something called popular sovereignty. Basically says, well, let's just let people go out and settle, and then once they're settled, they can vote whether they want it or not. Great idea. As you might imagine, you've got pro-slavery folks coming in, anti-slavery, trying to grab as much land as possible. Very soon, tensions build. There is intimidation back and forth, and ultimately violence breaks out. And here again, John Brown is going to be called back into action. He is in North Elba when he receives a letter from one of his grown sons. 4 of his sons are now living in Kansas, and they are trying to settle Kansas for the Free Soil Party, Free State. The letter essentially says, Father, we need your help. The pro-slavery groups are becoming more aggressive, more militant. If we don't have weapons and support, we will lose Kansas as a slave state. So this is all Brown needs to hear. And once again, he's called, will start traveling west. On his way, he has a wagon and he makes stops at several anti-slavery communities. He begins gathering weapons. And he arrives in 1855 with a wagon full of weapons, and he is ready to take up arms, essentially. They will spend a brutal winter in a cabin, Brown and his boys. This is one of those record breakers. Temperature plunged to 29 below zero. So they managed to survive that winter. And by 1856, they're ready to go into action. And whoa, look at that haircut. Brown is aged at this point. He's physically different than that last picture we just looked at. You can see his skin. It's almost like leather. This is honestly just from hard living. And I don't mean drinking. I mean living in exposed area, the Adirondacks. He almost died one time while he was out hiking in a blizzard, and someone happened to find him and save his life. Brown has always advocated violence. And in May of 1856, he's going to get his chance to put his words into action. What's going to happen before that, however, there's 2 events that lead up to Brown's ultimate actions at Potawatomi. This is the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas. Lawrence, Kansas was a free soil settlement. It was a town of anti-slavery folks. On May 21st of 1856, pro-slavery border ruffians move in. They do a lot of damage and they burn several buildings, including the hotel in the center of town. That's what you're looking at here is the Free Soil Hotel. When Brown learned of this, he became incensed. Not only that the pro-slavery men had attacked Kansas, but he was infuriated that no one had defended it. We need to go into action. The next day, Charles Sumner, the radical abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, a few days before he had given a speech called The Crimes Against Kansas. And in this speech, he had called out a senator from South Carolina named Butler. On this afternoon, Sumner is seated at his desk, and a senator from South Carolina named Preston Brooks, who happens to be Senator Butler's nephew, walks up to him, raises a gutta percha walking cane, and starts smashing Sumner over the head. Now, Sumner is a big guy. He's 6'4", and he was built like a linebacker. But that after that first blow, he was out, and Preston Brooks just kept continually beating him until the cane broke, and he still kept hitting with it. He almost beat Charles Sumner to death. So this is what I mean. This is how just tumultuous this whole era has become. You've got fighting in Kansas. Now you have fighting in the halls of the Senate. When Brown gets word of this, one of his sons writes that when we got word of Charles Sumner's beating, we just went crazy. And he wrote that word twice. So you have to picture Brown and his men just becoming infuriated. On the night of May 24th, 1856, Brown and 6 men, including 4 of his grown sons, set out after dark in a damp wind on a mission. These men are seething with anger. They are carrying broadswords. I mentioned them earlier. Here is a broadsword. It looks like a medieval weapon. Just a vicious weapon. But Brown and his men are headed toward a creek called Potawatomi, where there are a string of cabins known to be occupied by pro-slavery families, and they're on a mission of retaliation. They reach the cabin of James Doyle, and it's after dark right now. They knock on the door. When the door opens, Brown and his men barge in, and they start grabbing James Doyle. He's got 3 grown sons, and you need to kind of picture this in your head. This is a tiny cabin. At night, there was probably maybe a fire, maybe a flickering lantern or shadows all over the place, just total chaos. They begin to drag Doyle and his 3 grown sons out, and Mrs. Doyle is hysterical. She's screaming, she's begging for mercy, and Brown actually takes some pity on her and leaves the youngest boy in the cabin. But they take James Doyle and his 2 sons outside in a short distance from the front door. Brown gives the word, and his men lay in with the broadswords and hack these men to death. When it is all over, John Brown would walk up to James Doyle, put a pistol to his forehead, and pull the trigger. They leave these corpses where they were, and they move on to their next stop. The second cabin is owned by a man named Wilkinson. They knock on the door, and they ask, "Are you opposed to the Free State Party?" Wilkinson answers, "Yes." They barge him, drag him out in front of his wife, who was begging for mercy. They slash his head open and slit his throat. They move on. They reach a third cabin, the cabin of James Harris. It's after midnight at this point. They smash down the door, and they find 4 men sleeping inside. They question them. They actually let 3 men go, and one of the men who they found was a known pro-slavery man. They bring him outside. They split his head wide open and toss his body into the Potawatomi Creek. So by the next day, you've got 5 men brutally murdered. This will set off a wave of violence, and Kansas becomes known as Bleeding Kansas, with just retaliation back and forth, guerrilla fighting, real nasty stuff. John Brown is ultimately connected with his actions, even this massacre here, and he starts getting a name nationally. By the end of 1856, though, his position in Kansas is untenable. He's got people after him, and he will return back east. So what does this say about John Brown, this Potawatomi massacre? Well, first of all, he had always advocated violence. He said that was the only way to eradicate slavery, and we see now that he is a man of action and not just words. These men were basically defenseless, and they were killed in cold blood, regardless of their views on slavery. Many people have questioned Brown's sanity over this massacre, which is really a debate that's impossible to determine right now. When Brown returns east for the next 3 years, the last 3 years of his life, he would do that crisscrossing, talking to different groups, giving speeches, trying to raise money. And then by 1859, once again, we see that Brown has aged quite a bit, and he's changed his look. He's got this epic ZZ Top beard he's grown, and this is actually part of his new plan. He has an idea. Of course, he's the instrument of God, that he will be able to eradicate slavery once and for all. He will put that plan into action on October night in 1859. He will strike at a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And for that story, you'll have to tune in next week.
Thank you, Tom.
All right, what do I do now?
Well, if you wouldn't mind going back to your very first slide, we did get a question in the chat about that photograph.
Okay.
And for everyone else, if you have any questions or comments, please add them to the chat feature, and we will address those momentarily. So one of our participants wanted to know the origin of this photo and the significance of this photo. Is there a story?
That is, yes, that's actually a close-up of, I believe, the one of him holding the flag. It was taken in Springfield in probably the early 1850s by Augustus Washington, who was that African-American photographer of the time. And it's just, I love that picture. One of the things, and this, we have the same problem with Lincoln, is that for most of Brown's life, he never had facial hair. And anytime you see a picture of John Brown, it's that last with the big beard. He never had a beard. And Lincoln too, he'd never had a beard until he was like 50 years old. He grew it, and that's the image we have of Lincoln. So I also like this photograph because we can see those piercing eyes that people talk about, that intensity. And we can also see how quickly he ages. And that's just, again, I think it's from that hard life, all that stress, and just everything kind of piling up on him.
Absolutely. Another question came in, Tom. Could you talk about Brown's connection to the transcendentalists like Thoreau?
Yes. When Brown was traveling, which he did quite often, he would often visit homes of notable people, Longfellow, Emerson, Thoreau, and they really wanted to talk to him because he kind of became somewhat of a celebrity. And Brown had that intensity, and everyone that met him was impressed. Ultimately, some of the transcendentalists were disappointed in Brown in his ultimate action in Harper's Ferry, but he did associate with all of them, and it was actually some of those groups that were able to provide him support, financial support. We'll talk next week about the Secret Six. We'll get more into that.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to next week already.
Great.
Any other questions from our audience tonight? Tom, I'm wondering how you went about doing your research on John Brown.
Well, the difficult thing was leaving stuff out because there's just so much to this guy, to kind of keep it manageable. I kind of wanted to give a little bit of background of who he was and what he did. And then, of course, shed some light on why he became this person. And there's a lot of great sources out there. I'll throw two out right now. One is called To Purge This Land with Blood, written by Stephen Oates, who was a professor at UMass when I was there. And the other one I mentioned by David Reynolds, it's John Brown, Abolitionist, a more recent work. Those are excellent if you want to learn more about him.
Thank you. Any more questions? All right, we have another question here from Vanessa, is very engaged tonight. So John Brown is having a bit of a revival in certain activist circles on the left. And as a historian, could you comment on how he may be relevant to movements today? That's a great question, Vanessa.
That's a very good question, and it's impossible to answer. I went up to the John Brown site a couple days ago, and I saw the Black Lives Matter signs all around his statue. It was really moving. It kind of just took me a little bit. I started to kind of tear up a little bit. But as far as what would he think about today, I don't know. I really don't know. My hunch is that he would be the man that he always was. But so much has changed today that it's really like trying to compare the old cliche apples and oranges. When he was fighting slavery, that was guaranteed by the Constitution, where there was an objective that he was trying to reach. So today's issues are so much more difficult to solve. So a man like Brown would say, we need to do this, this, and this. Today, I don't know if that really works as well, his attitude. He would definitely sympathize with what's going on, though, absolutely.
Thank you. Another question. Do you believe that Malcolm X followed some of his teachings and methodology?
Oh, I know he did. He actually referred to John Brown. And a lot of the civil rights leaders, whether you followed Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, they could pick up on John Brown. And that Douglas quote that he said that in sympathy, John Brown is a black man. The fact that he had no prejudice. He's really someone to look up to when you're talking about fighting social injustice. So I think that people like Malcolm X really saw that, and again, you know, kind of picked up on that radical side of Brown. So absolutely.
And to piggyback off that too, Tom, do you have any insight into what shaped John Brown's determination that violence was the course of action needed?
I think it goes back to that religious background where, you know, the Old Testament God of War, he looked up to Oliver Cromwell, who was a crucial figure in the English Civil War, who was fighting in the name of God, but he was violent and vicious as could be. So he sort of emulated himself after that. Like I said, he read a lot of history, and that's how he justified the violence and the killing with what he called, you know, for the good of mankind. He was wiping away sin. I think it was just a combination of things. And he was right. It would take the Civil War.
Sure. All right. Any final questions? One audience member asks, didn't John Brown use violence only after decades of trying other ways? Is that true to your knowledge, Tom?
Well, he was active on the Underground Railroad. I mean, there were things that he did, but you read from very early on, violence was the only way that he believed in. And it wasn't until like I mentioned, the 1850s when things really sort of become like one after the other that it reached critical mass. And John Brown, you know, if you're going to settle Kansas as a free state and the pro-slavery groups are coming out and they are killing people, you have to fight back with that. And in fact, if you look at the killing as a whole, 75% of it was done with by the pro-slavery groups. So they were much more violent. Brown helped help slaves escape from Missouri when he was out in Kansas. So he did a lot of other things. Like I said, it was so tough to leave things out. But ultimately, he knew that violence was the only way.
Yeah, I'm sure it was difficult to
Yeah.
refine the content for tonight. And and as you said, there is a part 2 next week. Our last
Yes.
question for this evening, you mentioned that John Brown traveled extensively. Did he have any firsthand exposure to any of the southern states? You mentioned some of the West Coast and the Midwest and Eastern. What about the southern states?
He did travel into Maryland and I think Western Virginia. He was, I think, surveying at some point, but not extensively, no. No. Missouri was a slave state, but it would end up being a border state, but yes.
Okay.
That was it. Matter of fact, he mentions, as he's about to be hanged, a strange quote, but he says, "This is beautiful country. I never got to see it before." But yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to turn it back over to Selena for our closing remarks, and I hope to see everyone next week.
Thank you.
Right, thank you, Tom. That was just excellent. I really enjoyed that presentation, and I'm hoping all of you did as well. Just before we go, I'd like to send out a couple big thank yous to the North Country Foundation for helping us, put these programs together. Certainly to the Opportunity to Share Committee for coming together each week to decide how to best, bring programming to your community, our enrollment department. But most importantly, I want to thank all of you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this presentation, and we look forward to you joining us in the future. If you have comments on what you would like to see or what you would like us to present or think about, please send them in the survey or just put them in the chat. We hope to see you next week. Have a great evening, everyone. Bye.